You want to know how good someone's acting really is. It's when you watch them fall in love on screen, while in real life, they can't stand each other so much, they don't even want to be in the same space. And honestly, the golden age of American TV probably did that better than anywhere else. These sitcoms once made the whole country believe in love, believe in that kind of chemistry that feels impossible to break. But off camera, the story was completely different. Some pairs were so tense they stressed out the entire crew. Others were even more bitter because they weren't just co-stars, they were real-life spouses, and what the public called a dream turned out to feel more like a nightmare. Today, we're going back through 11 famous sitcom couples who made audiences fully believe in what they saw on screen, even though behind the scenes, it was a totally different story. Get ready, because the couple you thought was true love might be on this list too. Number 1. Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. I love Lucy. Maybe you're like me, getting completely hooked on a couple on screen and then seeing them walk straight into a real-life marriage. To the public, that feels almost like a stamp of guaranteed happiness. It tells people the love they believed in all those years was actually real. But for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, what all of America called a dream sometimes felt more like a price they had to pay. And honestly, this is where I always feel this story hits harder than almost any other behind-the-scenes conflict. Because Lucy and Desi weren't two strangers thrown onto the same set who just learned to tolerate each other. They really loved each other, really got married, really built a life together. So when America watched Lucy and Ricky on screen, people weren't just seeing a charming sitcom couple. They were seeing a whole post-war American dream. A house with the lights on, a marriage full of energy, but still safe. A world where after every misunderstanding and every emotional outburst, the man still comes home. The woman still holds the family together, and everything falls back into place before the ending music plays. But off camera, that marriage was nowhere near as peaceful as people wanted to believe. Work pressure, fame, brutal schedules, drinking, personal wounds, and cracks in trust slowly wore it down piece by piece. What's always felt chilling to me about this story is the audience believed marriage was the destination of happiness, while for the people inside it, it sometimes felt like a gilded cage. Beautiful, shining, admired by the whole country, but living inside it was a completely different story. That's why Lucy and Ricky weren't just a sitcom couple. They were one of the most beautiful and saddest illusions American television ever sold to the public. The whole country saw a happy ending. But Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz had to carry that spotlight in their real lives. At that point, it's not even about hating each other anymore. It's when real love, real marriage, and real fame crash into each other so hard that none of them stay the same. And this is just the beginning of the list. Let's move on to the second couple, with a story that got even more serious, affecting the entire cast and crew. Number 2. Martin Payne and Gina Waters. Martin. Can you believe it? Some sitcom couples make people laugh. Martin and Gina did more than that. They brought this kind of energy to the screen that you just can't fake unless the show is truly on fire. They argued, teased, got annoyed with each other, then pulled right back together like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's why their real-life story feels like a derailment right in the middle of American TV's golden era. And honestly, if I were part of that crew, the thing that would stress me out the most wouldn't be the shooting schedule or the ratings pressure. It would be having to watch those two bring their real-life tension into work every single day. Then, a few minutes later, step in front of the camera like they were still an inseparable couple. That's the strangest part about Martin and Gina. The audience would never guess, because the only place they still seemed to belong together was on television. But behind the scenes in real life, in the very way the show had to keep going, everything had already cracked. Tisha Campbell sued Martin Lawrence and the production. She left the show. Then she came back to finish the final episodes, but under conditions where the two of them were basically no longer working together in any normal way. And if this story shows a sitcom that couldn't hide the cracks at its core anymore, the next one is bitter in a completely different way. Number 3. Fred and Ethel Mertz, I Love Lucy. If there's any couple that proves golden age, American television wasn't built just on charm, but also on iron discipline. It's Fred and Ethel Mertz. On screen, they were the all-too-familiar image of a marriage that had been through everything. No more sweet flirting, no polished romance made to look pretty. Instead, you had complaints that sounded more intimate than love talk, sharp side glances like razors, and that kind of arguing only people who've been together forever can have. Fred and Ethel weren't there to make people dream. They made people believe. And on television, sometimes being believable matters more than being lovable. That's exactly why the real-life story of Vivian Vance and William Frawley feels so bitter. They could barely stand each other. Vance openly disliked having to play the wife of a co-star more than 20 years older than her. A kind of discomfort that almost felt like disgust. Frawley knew it, and it hit his pride hard. From that point on, there was this cold tension between them that didn't need to be named. Not a temporary mood, not just a bad day, but a level of resentment clear enough that people in the industry knew while the audience almost never saw it. And that's what still impresses me about I Love Lucy to this day. Because when the cameras rolled, every crack disappeared. Fred and Ethel still came across like a couple born to play off each other perfectly. That's something TV today still tries to do, but doesn't always reach. And we're not done yet. This list still has more couples you once wished were real, only to be disappointed when you learn the truth. Ready for number 4. Number 4, Tim and Jill Taylor, Home Improvement. On screen, Tim and Jill were a very believable marriage. Tim was loud, cocky, always like a grown kid who just found a new toy. Jill was grounded, steady, the one keeping the whole house from tipping over. They were written like two people who genuinely needed each other to stay standing. Not the kind of wife who just stands there to complete the picture. Jill was Tim's counterweight. Honestly, a lot of the time she was the only anchor keeping the entire family from drifting off with all of his dumb ideas. And then came the moment money got put on the table. I've always felt like that's the moment that strips everything bare faster than any argument. Patricia Richardson said that when it came time to negotiate the next season, ABC offered her $1 million per episode. Tim Allen was offered double. Just hearing those numbers is enough. No one has to raise their voice, no scandal, no tabloid headlines. The imbalance shows itself in one clean, cold cut like that. That's what makes this case more bitter than people realize. It's not loud, it's not dramatic in the sense of throwing glasses or flipping tables or tearing apart the set. It's polite, it's neat. It has that very Hollywood style I've seen over and over again for years. The screen gives you a modern, balanced, smart marriage, while the contract behind it quietly says, there's really only one center of power. So every time I look back at Tim and Jill, I don't just see a sitcom couple that made America laugh. I see a pretty uncomfortable reminder that television can write you a beautiful, balanced, convincing marriage, and then right behind it, operate on standards so outdated they don't even bother hiding it. But at least here, the imbalance shows through money and power. The next story is even quieter. No numbers on the table, just a couple that felt too real, too lived in, and then quietly left behind a cold, empty space the audience doesn't always notice right away. Number 5. Dan and Roseanne Connor. Roseanne. Not every TV couple falls apart with shouting. Some stories feel even more unsettling because they don't explode in front of the audience. They just close off in a kind of cold silence that takes years for people to realize that between two people, once tied together in their memories, there's nothing left to say. For me, Dan and Roseanne are that kind of story. Dan and Roseanne weren't the kind of sitcom couple written for people to look up at and dream about. They didn't live in shiny houses, didn't talk like every line was polished to sound charming. They were tired, struggling, irritated, funny, loving each other in a way that felt very real, very American, like families counting every bill, but still trying to hold on to some dignity at the end of the day. That's why when audiences watched them, they didn't just see a TV couple. They saw a marriage that felt like it had taken enough hits to never break. Then time passed, and reality outside the frame told a completely different story. John Goodman later said he hadn't spoken to Roseanne Barr for years. On the surface, that sounds like a dry statement, but to me, that dryness is exactly what makes it bitter. No loud scandal for people to gather around, no public battle to shock and intrigue. Just a long, cold distance that feels sadder the more you think about it. I've always found stories like this more unsettling than any loud conflict. A heated argument at least shows something is still burning. But long silence is different. It's like a door closing very gently, but from that moment on, the house never echoes the same way again. And with Dan and Roseanne, what makes it even more haunting is that audiences believed this was a marriage that didn't need to be pretty, to be strong, didn't need to be romantic, to be warm, didn't need to be perfect to last through time. Number 6. George Sr. and Lucille Bluth. Arrested Development. This might be the rare couple on this list, where if you hear someone say they didn't get along in real life, your first reaction isn't shock. It's more like, yeah, that actually makes sense. Because George Sr. and Lucille Bluth were never written as a marriage that makes people believe in love. They were written as a sharp satire of money power, selfishness, and that kind of wealth that's rotten from the inside. These two didn't live together to warm each other. They lived together to tear at each other, control each other, and make the whole Bluth house feel heavier every time you walked in. That's why the behind-the-scenes story of Jeffrey Tambor and Jessica Walter has such a strange aftertaste. It doesn't shatter a beautiful dream, because there was never a dream to begin with. It just makes everything more uncomfortable, sharper, and honestly sadder in a very dry way. Jessica Walter said that Jeffrey Tambor verbally abused her on set, and that alone is enough to push this story far beyond normal tension. This isn't just two co-stars not getting along, not just a few bad days. When someone recalls that experience with the hurt still clear in their voice, the atmosphere has gone way past what people casually call a feud. With other couples on this list, at least people can mourn something that was once beautiful. But here, you look at George Sr. and Lucille on screen, and already see a marriage so warped it almost turns toxicity into comedy. Then you look behind the scenes and realize that edge didn't fully stay in the performance. That feeling isn't tragic like Lucy and Daisy. It's not cold like Martin and Gina. It leaves this hard-to-describe taste like sitcoms sometimes take something already broken and polish it into comedy for the whole country to laugh at. If you're still here, go ahead and hit like on the video before we move into the second half of the list. Because from here on out, these stories don't get any softer. They just get harder to believe. Number 7. George Costanza and Susan Ross, Seinfeld. Not every sitcom couple falls apart because of intense hatred, bitter betrayal, or some behind-the-scenes war that keeps the whole crew up at night. Some relationships fail in a much stranger way. They just never work in the first place. George and Susan are one of those cases. George Costanza never really looked like the kind of guy born to step into a proper engagement. Just watching George try to behave like someone about to get married already feels off from the start. Meanwhile, Susan Ross carries a completely different energy, more put together, more proper, like she walked out of a different show and somehow ended up in George's world. The two of them standing next to each other always creates this odd feeling, not because they're too intense, but because they don't seem to belong to the same rhythm of life at all. And in real life, that feeling wasn't just on screen. Jason Alexander later said he could hardly find a way to act that matched Heidi Swedberg. I've always thought this kind of crack is very unique because it's not loud in the way audiences usually imagine. No heavy accusations, no tabloid-style drama. Just a very dangerous truth for sitcoms. When two actors can't get their energy to line up, everything starts slipping little by little. But at least here, the story still revolves around an uncomfortable mismatch. The next one is way more complicated. This time, between a sitcom couple, it's not just about not getting along, it's about personal beliefs, image, pressure, and one person thinking they have the right to decide the other person's fate. Number 8. Mike Seaver and Julie Costello. Growing Pains. This is no longer just about two people not getting along. This is when a family sitcom starts carrying a tone of judgment. And honestly, there aren't many things that bother me more than that. Mike and Julie weren't the kind of couple that made audiences go crazy like the big romances on American television. But they had exactly what Growing Pains needed at that time: youth likability, and that very natural feeling of a relationship that could grow inside a home familiar to millions of viewers. Julie didn't enter the show like a storm. She came in quietly fitting just right, like she had always belonged there. The issue here wasn't Mike and Julie arguing in real life, and it wasn't some explosive hatred that made the whole crew panic. This story is more uncomfortable because it feels like a moral judgment. At the time, Kirk Cameron was increasingly tying his image to very strong religious beliefs, and Julie McCullough got pulled right into that collision when her past posing for Playboy was brought under scrutiny. The moment you hear that, you can feel the atmosphere shift. This is no longer just about two actors playing a romantic storyline in a sitcom. It starts to feel like one person trying to apply their own standards onto someone else, letting that affect how she's seen, how she's written, even whether she stays or gets pushed out. Maybe that's why this story sticks. Not because it's the loudest, but because it hits a very uncomfortable question in old Hollywood. When a star believes they're protecting the moral integrity of a show, where exactly is the line between personal belief and control over someone else? What about you? What do you think? Share your thoughts before we move on to another couple with an even worse situation. Number 9. Dre and Bow Johnson. Black-ish. Not every couple that doesn't get along in real life ends up feeling awkward on screen. Some people carry tension for almost 10 years, and then when they finally land in the right place at the right time, they create a sitcom marriage that audiences completely believe in. Dre and Bow are that kind of story, and honestly, I like this kind a lot more than the loud arguments tabloids usually chase. Because Black-ish doesn't sell a fake perfect marriage. Dre and Bow argue like real adults living under the same roof. They love each other, get annoyed with each other, challenge each other, then come back to that familiar place of long-term couples. They don't always agree, but they understand each other well enough to know exactly how far to push things. That kind of chemistry doesn't come from a few clever lines. It comes from the feeling that these two people have been through enough together that every argument carries history behind it. Anthony Anderson once said Tracy Ellis Ross didn't like him for nearly 10 years, all because of an old joke from before Black-ish. Just that alone is enough to make people raise an eyebrow. 10 years is long enough for discomfort to turn into habit, long enough for distance to feel natural. And yet, when the two of them stepped into Black-ish, the audience didn't see any of that history. All they saw was a modern marriage that was witty, exhausting, warm, cracked, and repaired, basically alive in the way real marriages usually are. That's why Dre and Bow are memorable, not because of their real-life tension, but because they turned that tension into the foundation for something completely different. A screen marriage that's sharp, warm, and real enough to make people forget there was ever a distance that lasted almost a decade. But if here things were ultimately saved by maturity and experience, the next story has a completely different tone. This time, it's about youth, early awkwardness, and a real-life twist so ironic that if a sitcom had written it, people might say it was too much. Number 10. Jackie Burkhart and Michael Kelso. That 70s Show. This is one of the most ironic stories on the entire list, not because it's the darkest, not because it's the most toxic, but because time came back, erased almost the entire first draft, and then rewrote it with such a beautiful ending that the public started to believe it had always been that way from the start. Looking at Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher, now a lot of people naturally assume they must have had chemistry both on and off screen from day one. Jackie and Kelso were a perfect match, playful, childish in their arguments, constantly breaking up and getting back together, exactly the kind of sitcom couple people shake their heads at but can't look away from. The thing is, public memory loves to tidy things up. It looks at the real-life ending, then starts imagining fate had been quietly writing that story all along. Real life is rarely that polite. That's what makes this story both funny and frustrating to me. When That 70s Show started, there was none of that destined love vibe between Mila and Ashton that people now like to project backward onto them. There was awkwardness. There was an age gap. There was that sense that they were standing next to each other for work, first not walking onto set, as two pieces perfectly made for each other. In other words, the screen saw something the people involved hadn't even lived yet. But if this story is ironic because time rewrote the audience's memory, the final entry goes in a completely different direction. This time, there's no fate at all, just two adults, a long-running set, and a very real kind of tension that only a believable sitcom marriage can create. Number 11. Doug and Carrie Heffernan. The King of Queens. I've always thought the best couple to close this list shouldn't be the most shocking or the most toxic. It should be the most real. And Doug and Carrie are exactly that. They don't give the audience a love story to dream about. They give them a marriage that looks like it's actually lived through years, through bills, through exhaustion, through cold dinners, through days where just looking at each other is enough to be annoying, and yet they still don't walk away. That's why the real-life story of Kevin James and Leah Remini makes me think more than it shocks me. Leah once said there were days when the two of them didn't speak until the cameras started rolling. On the surface, that doesn't sound dramatic at all. No lawsuits, no public fights, no standoffs that make the whole crew hold their breath. Just a very real, very adult kind of tension, the kind that comes from two people working together, too long, too close, too often, to the point where some days the best thing you can do is say nothing until the lights come on. And maybe that's exactly why Doug and Carrie close this list so perfectly. After all the stories about hatred, distance, power judgment, and cracks that couldn't be hidden, what stays with me in the end is something smaller but more real. A believable on-screen marriage isn't always built from perfect harmony. I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way. Every time I go back to old sitcoms, what keeps me watching isn't just the laughter. I love the couples too, the way they argue, make up, support each other, and light up a room just by walking into the frame together. Maybe that's why when you learn what happened in real life, the feeling is always mixed. A little surprise, a little discomfort, and some regret too. But at the end of the day, real life has never worked as neatly as movies and TV. And maybe that's exactly why what actors manage to do on screen feels even more impressive. What about you? After this list, what feeling stays with you? Do you see it as just part of the acting profession, or do you still feel a bit of regret for the couples you once believed were more perfect than that? And don't forget to tell us if you like this topic, or if you want us to take it in a different direction. Maybe in the next video, we'll flip it around and look at couples who hated each other on screen, but were surprisingly close in real life. Drop your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.